I have an announcement. The lady that was going to, Professor Paula Hamilton, that was in conversation with Catherine Cole today is unwell and won't be able to come. So, luckily, for all of us, Christine Sykes and Catherine Cole did a conversation together at the Sydney Writers' Festival down in Wollongong. So Christine very happily stepped in, and so we're very pleased to have both Christine here, our Vice President, and Catherine. Catherine Cole is the child of 10-pound poems from the UK. Her book, Slipstream, on memory and migration, explores this experience. In conversation, Catherine will discuss why she wrote Slipstream and what research and writing challenges it presented. Catherine is Honorary Professor at Liverpool John Moores University in Merseyside, the UK, and the University of Wollongong, and has taught creative writing and literary studies at both. She's published 10 books, including novels, short stories, memoir, academic writing, non-fiction, and edited collections. Her work has won or been shortlisted for some of Australia's leading literary prizes. I hope you enjoy this afternoon as much as my friend Maureen over here and I enjoyed about 2 weeks ago at the Women's Club a day with Catherine. It was a wonderful day, and I know that we are going to enjoy another wonderful afternoon. Please welcome Christine and Catherine.
Because I have had the pleasure of reading her book several times, as well as discussing it with her both one-on-one and also in Wollongong as part of the Sydney Writers' Festival. I have known Catherine for a while, and passed across several times, and we have a friend colleague in common, so it is a delight to read this book. And I felt that the schedule today was amazing because we had Paddy this morning doing a workshop on memoir, and this afternoon we have Catherine talking about her memoir. So let me ask the first question then, Catherine. Given that you've written novels, short stories, academic papers, why did you decide to write the memoir then?
Well, I suppose I've written a memoir in the past I wrote Poet Who Forgot, which was about my friendship with A.D. Hope when I was a young friends with him. So that mingled letters and memoir at the time, but it was very different from anything I'd written before. This Slipstream was a far more personal one, I think. Instead of personal writing about my youthful friendship with A.D. Hope, but this was much more personal in the sense it was about my family and my parents in particular. And I have been working in Liverpool in the UK, which is not very far from Yorkshire where my parents grew up. So I was very engaged in the north of England and thinking I've been wanting to do something with my family history for quite a while. And of course, being an academic, you can apply for research grants, internal ones that allow you to travel locally and so on. So I just got a small grant and took myself off to Yorkshire and started sort of tramping around the family places and realising how much I just wanted to capture that experience whilst I was actually in the place. And the more I have lived in England over the last 7 years, the more I realised there was a lot of recalibrating I had to do about what I thought my parents' life was really like. For example, the stories they told. When I was a child, even as an adult, saying, why didn't you ever go from Yorkshire to London? It's 2 hours, for God's sake. And I realised once I was living in Liverpool, it's not that easy. It's very expensive to travel by train in England unless you book a long way ahead, half the time cancelled. And there are all these issues. So I started to see memoir as a way to sort of delve a bit more. And I think also as you get older, as we were saying earlier, as you get older, you do reflect more on your life and what you've achieved or what you'd like to do yet. And memoir just seemed a good way to sort of probe a bit more into that life.
And while we're on memoir, you do reflect in the memoir about the difference between truth and fiction in stories. And you have a wonderful Ron Martha's quote about when someone's reading his memoir, they should suspend belief as if it was a novel. Did you find that when you were writing your memoir?
Yeah, I think, you know, my parents are both dead, so I really couldn't ask them. And I don't know if many of you have read Pirandello's short stories, Italian writer, Sicilian writer, where they were made into a film called Chaos by the Taviani brothers, film directors in the movie 80s. And one of my favourite stories, and the last story in the film, is of an old man going back to his childhood home and trying to create a memory of his mother, his dead mother, to tell him the story so he can write it. And it was a bit like that with my parents and writing memoir, just how you think you know the truth. You've had conversations, you've been, you know, exploring family history or whatever, but is it true, is it accurate or not? And I'll hold it close to the phone. And so that was really a key part of it, just thinking how close do I get to the truth here? And in the end, I realised I just had to write it as my truth, and just insert myself, if you like, in there as the young love narrator, saying, in a way, this has been a disbelief, because this is my story and I'm telling it as I remember it. The complicated factor, I suppose, in all of this, and that's right through the book, is that when I was writing the book, my brother was dying as well of cancer, and I was sending him sections to read desperately almost. There's a sort of desperation that when you know you're losing your sibling, and they are a witness to the life as well. It was both sad and troubling, but also very important that I would give him sections and say, this is what I remember when I was 5. He's 8 years or so older than me. And he would either confirm or suggest or just deny, you know, all those things. So I think, you know, the memoir is a bit like a patchwork quilt, you know. You just sort of go with the pieces and put them together as best you can, knowing that there are going to be differences of thought, and truth will sometimes need to step back to a kind of literary aesthetic, sometimes. And I'll just come to the final point on this. My younger sister, who was also born in Australia like me, was sort of a bit cagey with me one day, and I said, you know, what's wrong? And she said, can I take you up on some points in the book? And she was really quite hurt that I called my father a sugar baby. Because he was called a sugar baby by his relatives as sook. You know, he was the youngest child, very sick. And he carried it in old age, and she was offended that I called him a sugar baby. I didn't really think his brother's doing that. And also my parents' house was rather messy. They really were one step away from one of those TV programs where someone comes in and cleans out. It was always clean, it was it's full of stuff, you know, and Dad collected stuff. And I mentioned in the book that the house felt very overcrowded. And she said, oh, Mum, they weren't that bad. I thought, you know, you have memory.
If I could, there's so much I could unpick from that, but let me just, with the messy house, one of the points you made in the book is that it reflected very much in parents, the fact that they were not only 10 homes, they were 10 homes from Yorkshire, and that meant something quite different.
Yeah. Does anyone here have relatives from Yorkshire or the north of England? Yeah, okay. You know the northern ethos. Yeah. They're different in the north.
If I could say, Catherine does say that if you want to find out your shortcomings, go to Yorkshire.
Yeah, that's Bill Bryson. Bill Bryson said, yeah, if you want anyone to tell you your shortcomings, go to Yorkshire. And there was a marvellous thing, you've got to laugh at the Writers' Festival, the first aunt I ever met, elderly aunt, in Yorkshire, and we're talking Barnsley here. Barnsley has a very specific accent. And the aunt said to me, her first words were, "They look like the father, mournful like, this rolling Yorkshire voice." And I was only young, and was sort of taken aback. But there was a sort of straight to the chase, you know, always. And so there is that sort of very strong northern identity. And in the book, I talk about how my parents transplanted that into Sydney southwestern suburbs. You know, they came out from England. They had never much gone out of Yorkshire. They lived in a small mining village not far from Barnsley. Then they all got, and they were quite timid people, and they had 2 small children, and they got on a boat in Glasgow. So they got a train from Barnsley, I think, to Wakefield, and then to Manchester, and then up to Glasgow, and then they got on an ocean liner and travelled for 12,000 miles with 2 little kids, and moved to Bankstown with my aunt and uncle who was sponsoring them, and created a new life in Australia. But they hung on to the old life, as so many migrants do. It's like a touchstone, isn't it? So my dad had his cloth cap sent out from Sheffield, and he wore a cloth cap most of his life. And my whole life I lived a Yorkshire kind of existence. And we ate park, and then we followed Leeds Football Club, and we had Yorkshire pudding on any Yorkshire puddings, I suppose. But we did all these things for very, very Yorkshire. And they got the Daleston magazine, and it was interesting, the Daleston, I wrote to them and said, "Look, I've written this book, and you're mentioned in it," because my dad read the Daleston, and so they did a 2-page article about the book, about how Yorkshire was transplanted to Bankstown. And so this was the sort of life. And I think that as a child, when you are a child of migrants, you so cling to their identities, their former identities. And I do say it wasn't common just to me. I had friends from Lithuania and Ukraine and Spain and all that when I was growing up. Their parents were the same. They all had things that were touchstones of their former place. But I mean, for me, it was, as an adult, it was lovely. As a child, I thought it was excruciatingly embarrassing. Especially, you know, the sort of way they spoke. And Dad joked all the time. He had this Yorkshire jokey voice. And he'd say stuff like in a chocolate shop, he'd say, Darryl Lee or somewhere, he'd say things like, "If I pull 3 fares at me, will you throw a chocolate at me?" Or something. That's stupid stuff. And as a kid, it was the accent that did it every time. I used to think, oh my God, why can't you just be like an Australian?
You do talk on that note about how you were dressed up as a child to go to the city. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yeah, that's fun. You see it on today with migrant families as well. I used to see in Sydney, sometimes you go out and Aussie kids, you know, I'm saying that in a general way, often very casually dressed, shorts and shirts and all this stuff. When we went to Manly, you know, my parents would generally take us off to Manly Beach ferry after Sunday school, and they thought it was appropriate we were dressed up nicely to go to the beach. So I'd be wearing like frock with a net petticoat and a hat up into Sunday school, and all the other kids would be in shorts and jeans and muumuus and all the, you know, clothes people wore back then. And I looked at them really enviously, thinking, why do we have to be so dressed up? But it was that thing about who went to the city really dressed up. And I think I only managed to break free and scandalise my parents when I was about 16, and I went into town on the train with my friends. We were all wearing shorts. My father was like, "You're not going out of the house dressed like that." Yes, we are. But, you know, they believe in dressing up. And you still see it. People make their children look very spiffy. We just happened.
And you do talk about how you became a very Australian, particularly teenager, but a child and teenager, and embraced the sun, the surf, and the shorts, etc. But you also talk about how sometimes you felt like a bit out of sorts, like an out-of-tune piano, and reflected on that, sort of what happens to identity with migrant kids.
I think it's one of the most interesting things about migrant communities, and that is, you know, and I've said this in Wollongong, I get very cranky when politicians around election budget, we see it here, we see it in England, I'm sure we'll see lots of it in France. The idea that somehow migrants are easily used as dog whistle politics during election campaigns, I just hate it. I think it's so demeaning of the people. It's we're a migrant country, and we're Aboriginal. We come from somewhere so at some point. So let's stop talking about migration in these hideous and demeaning ways. You know, we have migrant backgrounds, and we delve into our history. But I think one of the other things is just that sense, and this is where, you know, with someone like Paula Hamilton, who spent her whole life researching migration and oral histories and migrant stories, this idea that there is this slightly discombobulated experience that the children often have, especially the first generation, where you are watching so closely the way your parents are behaving within the society. And you know, we tend to look at this a lot actively, and there's some wonderful books being written about it. George Kavaros' book on the old Greeks, where he explores his, you know, Greek family tradition growing up in Newcastle, where you kind of, as a child, very sensitive to your parents' reactions, and you're watching them, and I think that's where that discombobulation often comes from, that divided loyalty for a while anyway, where you are protective of your parents, and where also though you are confounded sometimes by what they're doing when no one else is doing it in the same way. It takes quite a lot. And I talk about in the book how my mother once helped me with a school assignment, and we had to stick pictures of the Queen, and we had to put where we were from. The kids drew pictures of, you know, Turkey or the Ukraine or whatever, and I had the Queen and then the Union Jack and all the other stuff that I cut out of some sort of English magazine. And I remember the Queen's face fell out of the book and then onto the ground. I didn't notice. And when I was in the playground later that day, I must have been about 8, I saw the Queen's face on the ground and realised it was dropped out of my book. And even to this day, I know the feeling I had as that small child was for my mother. I was looking at the little cut-out face, and even though it was Queen said it, it was also me thinking my mother did that, and she did it as an English person. And I was just aware of that place for her. It's funny how kids are that sensitive often. The children of mothers often are to their parents.
And we also find with many migrant families that, and my partner's Greek, so that's an experience of this with some of their Greek friends and family, where they hold on so much to what the place was like when they lived it. And when they go back, they are quite surprised that things have changed. Did your parents go back and did they find that?
Yeah, there were two things in my family that had an impact. One is all the kids went back first. So my sister went first. She was born in England, my older sister. She went back on one of the road ships, you know. And then my brother got married and went on a honeymoon cruise with his wife on the Canberra. And they travelled around to go. They didn't go to England, but they went all around the place, California included. And then I went back again by ship. So, you know, we were all, I think, linking our lives back to the old empire brand, you know, this, so there was that element of it. And in the book, I remember how important that first trip felt to me. It was like I was doing all the things my parents couldn't do when they left because they had no money and they didn't travel. So I sent thousands of postcards, no, hundreds of postcards, which my parents kept, and I'm going to use in the next book, of all the places I went to. And I realised how much I was living the life and travelling for them as much as for myself. So I would be describing all these things. And of course I went to Yorkshire and met all these relatives and did all these things. The other thing in that, when my parents did go back, they only went once, or my dad only went once. He was a bit anxious about it, and they flew both ways. He was a bit of a frightened flyer. And when they got there, you know, they started doing all sorts of nice things and seeing all the relatives and so on. But he had a hernia and had to go in hospital for a while. Of course, while he was in hospital, my mother had ball. Because, you know, she wasn't with dad, you know, always grumping around about being a sugar baby about things. So she had a good time. And when they came back to Australia, they said they were glad they left England. It was better here. That they realised they'd done the right thing. And the right thing for them was for the children. They were glad they'd come out and it was for the kids. So in the case of them, they really did, I think, realise they'd made the right decision. The only thing that was problematic, after Dad died, my mother went back 2 or 3 more times. And she had a lot of fun, you know, she was one of 10, and so she enjoyed the social world of it. So I think that was where it all fitted. So the kids, in a way, led to them going back.
And you also reflected that you talk about the accidental life, how often, and your family did this, a decision at the time that seems not maybe such a large decision, but it is the life-changing decision which your parents did.
Yeah, my parents came to Australia in the days where there was no guarantee you go back. I mean, a lot of 10-pound farms did go back, and then quite a few of those, when they went back, realised they made a mistake and come back again. Boomerangs, they were called boomerang 10-pound farms. But in the case of so many migrants, when they left, they didn't really think they'd necessarily go back. There was no Wi-Fi, there was no social media. My parents didn't have a telephone for a long time. So everything was done by aeroplane. And I remember as a child saying this because before all these monumental things like my grandfather died, so my mother's father dying, and her grief, all the things she couldn't go back to the funeral. And that was what made my brother's illness so terrible, because it was during COVID. So I couldn't come over to Australia anyway. So we were doing all this stuff by sort of Skype or Zoom. And it got to a point where my brother would put the camera on. I said, "What's wrong? You put the camera on." He said, "No, I don't want you to see what I look like." Those sorts of things are ghastly when you're a long, long way away. So I think that sort of is a terrible thing about what is a chosen migration. In my case, I love travel, but I've been living in England for 7 years. And I think, you know, there's a point at which you have to make decisions about where home is. And I feel very driven and torn between places. You know, I'm here now and I love being in Sydney, going back next week. You know, where do I feel most comfortable? I think children of migrants do often feel like an unworn ship. And I think that's where that accidental migration can kind of make you feel slightly, you know,
one of the things your parents did do though when they came in was very much committed to settling in Australia. And I found when I read this that even though my parents were in 10-pound farms, that was, you know, several generations in Australia, that a lot of the things that you described were so familiar to me that I was reading my memoir again. You grew up in Bankstown, I grew up in Cabramatta. Your family bought a block of land, built a garage, the whole family lived in a garage until the house was built. I had exactly the same experience. One of my best friends when I was about 11 was an English Tom. Had come out of actually Liverpool Hostel at the time. And also I grew up on the street with a lot of other migrant kids. So I found that really, really interesting, that whole experience of settlement and making do in a new land as a kind of, I guess, working class kid and then becoming not a working class kid.
Yeah, I think that Australian history it's never been all that engaged. Well, maybe it has and I've just not quite got it. But I understand, you know, I grew up reading Ruth Park and what's the woman who wrote Bobbing Up, you know, all of these different writers, and I think, gosh, you know, Australian working class history is really interesting. And also the migrant history is really interesting, and British migration. I've been written about, gender violence has become a bit more to the fore recently. So I think that one of the things that felt very isolating for me as a child were stories that I was reading. I read all the books my parents recommended, which were of course about children in English boarding schools. And all I wanted as growing up for quite a long time was to be sent off to a British boarding school where I was going to have a midnight snack with my friends and toast crumpets and fire. All that sort of stuff. And meanwhile, we're living in a garage in Bankstown with cicadas and a huge garden with my parents grew fruit, veg and stuff. And it really wasn't until probably sometime later, and when I think of all the Australian magazine for schools, where they had stories by Nan Chauncey, Ivan Sutherland, you think about all the writers of that era, they suddenly were writing books like Storm Boy or I can't actually, I'm just trying to think of all the names, but books that I started reading made me feel much, much more connected to Australia. But I think one of the things that really shocked me was I thought we were the only people pretty much who lived in a garage and were building houses. I realised as an adult there were thousands of us. And that film Silver City, about, the family in Wollongong were building the house, suddenly made me realise, that this was a social and cultural movement. And I think it would be great that more and more of this stuff creeps into Australian film and stories, because they are the lived experiences of our generation and younger generations still watching.
And I can't let that go without saying the other commonality we have is we have a certain person as a hero who did change things for working class kids, and that was Gough Whitlam.
Yeah, you talk about it. Well, I think the whole thing about Gough Whitlam and that government was so reformist, and so many good things happened as a result that it's still around today, like Medicare and non-fault laws and multiculturalism, a stronger sense of Australian identity that came out of the 70s. So yes, I think Gough Whitlam transformed my life. And I think, in the book I mentioned that idea suddenly of being Australian came to the fore much more actively around that time. And I think that baby generation did start feeling a bit more political. I don't know, I don't know about people who went before, but it certainly felt to me like I'd really moved on from my parents by then. They were still Yorkshire, but they were also, I think, letting go by them.
And I think Whitlam to me is a symbol of this, but he wasn't the only one. I think Australia was changing a bit as well. And what it meant to be an Australian was broadening, so that you could be from Yorkshire and Australia, you could be from Greece and Australia.
Yeah, I think in Vietnam War, all of those things started to make people feel, and we were all travelling a lot more. I think everything was starting to move on in different ways. But
And one of the things that I thought was very special about your book is that you do combine your personal story with references to migration policy, to other literary references, etc. So your description of it as a bit of a patchwork quilt book was very apt. Do you want to talk about that and how you pulled those different elements together?
I think other people in the room writing a memoir, you were thinking about memoirs, I think the thing that always interests me, I really like the writing creative non-fiction. So memoir is, it's a very singular term in some ways. I think what makes memoir-based writing interesting is the way in which the personal is part of the wider context of the world, so in writing a book about my parents' migration, it almost seems impossible not to at least reflect on what was happening around them. So I can talk about myself as a child growing up in the western suburbs and all the things that were happening in my life to me individually, but the things that were playing out around my parents were really important to that narrative as well. So I think for anyone writing a memoir, do think about where you locate yourself within the story. And I was mentioning to Wynne and Chris earlier, I worked with a man in England who's now at Manchester University called Horatio Clear. It's a great name, isn't it? And he writes a book a year, and he's a very famous, well-connected writer in England. And he writes, anything he writes, he locates himself in it to a degree. So when he wrote about walking in the footsteps of Bach, he walked through parts of Germany and Austria. You're with him, but you're reading about Bach. So that mix of memoir and other writing, I think, is a really interesting patchwork of writing. And I also just think, because when you're writing a memoir, you're often drawing on that earlier you, the child you who was observing the world so closely, and that's what's feeding your memoir. It's not just who you are now, it's all the things you've been before to make you who you are now. And so in a way, the child is making sense of the adult and vice versa within a memoir. And so, you know, when you're thinking of a 5-year-old listening to the radio or watching TV or doing certain things, they're also what lead to the way you see the world today and why you're writing in a certain way. So I think memoir is often one of the most multifaceted ways in which to write. And it's, you know, people talking about various books today like Life Can Buy and Thunder and so on, where the individual is in with the person they're writing about. So memoir does become that kind of blur between factual, fictional, creative, non-creative, all those things. And I think that makes it really interesting.
And how do you decide what to put where in the patchwork? Did you sort of cut bits up and have them all on a table?
Yeah, everyone who's been to my talks hears about beads and string. If ever you come to one of my classes, I talk about beads and string. I think people get hamstrung by structure too early when they write. And that is that you're far better off writing short pieces than working out where they go after you've written them. And so this is what I always say to my students, and we have a standing joke amongst all my students that, you know, oh no, Kevin's going to talk about beads and string. But if you write the beads, so if you're writing about the house you lived in, you write something strongly, potently about that. But then don't feel you've got to keep writing and writing it because that's where you started. Just put, once you've written as much as you want on that, or as much as you can on that, put it aside and think about something else. Because you're often inspired by something and you want to just get it down quickly. It might only be 3,000 words. Write it. Because you work out where it strings together when you've got quite a few of those. But I think, you know, structuring a novel or structuring a memoir is really quite hard because you may not want to begin in I was born in and move a certain way. You may want to start now and make those past experiences just short reflections where you're looking backwards and forwards. So I think that, you know, a structure can become a bit of a ball and chain if you impose it too heavily and too early.
And on creativity, you write this partly as an academic, but also largely as a creative person. Where did your creativity come from?
I think there are a number of things. One is reading. I mean, we all say this, it's so important to read, and I think that children read. I think children read for all sorts of reasons, escapism being one of them. But also, they make sense of the world, even the world of the English boarding school. There are things you learn as you read, and I think children who love to read, if there's a reader in the child, there's a writer in the child. And it's even now, you know, we say to students who do creative writing courses, look, you will cease to read just for pleasure, and you will now read forensically. You'll read forensically because you'll be asking every book you read, how did the author do this? And so I think a small child who loves to read wants to recreate what they're reading themselves. They write their own stories, they draw pictures, they do all those things. And I think my parents brought lots of books to Australia with them. I grew up with books like Golden Treasury, I know whose parents had those, and my mother's school prize books and so on. So they were precious and influential. And my parents always gave us books for birthdays and Christmas and so on. So we were all very avid readers, and I think I loved reading and loved writing. The other is this constant observation that I mentioned earlier, and that is at the moment of watching parents and other people and trying to make sense of them. And you don't have to be the child of migrants to experience these, there can be all sorts of reasons. But in the book I talk about some of those moments where as a child you just, I was fascinated by why my parents sounded the way they did, dressed the way they did. No other kid's father wore a cloth cap. But there was a guy who wore a black beret. And he, apparently I asked him if he had done a Carter, because I had done a Carter with a black beret. He just wore a black beret because that's what he did. So those things where children are trying to make sense out of the world, I think creates a kind of artistic observation that stays with you all your life. And in the book I talk about sitting at the kitchen table, and my mother, I think that was the day she got a letter or something telling my father had died. And I remember watching her, now I could shiver thinking about how old I was, 5, maybe 6, watching her crumple and cry. And on a piece of paper I wrote, "My mother is a crybaby." Isn't that awful? And I think about, someone told me, it must have told me I was a crybaby. But anyway, I wrote that. But that observation was so acute. And I think if you're an acutely observant child, you're acutely observing. We encourage students always, and people always watch, look, listen, you know, and I think that's where the creativity comes from. It's born from that.
And I think you also mentioned in the book that your parents brought their stories with them, and very much those listening to those stories germinated your creativity.
Yeah, there was, you know, my father was a great storyteller. He talked about throwing lumps of coal, you know, the tin bars people had on the outside of their houses, you know, that hang up an old tin bar. And he and his mates used to love running by someone's house and chucking a lump of slag or coal at the tin bar to make a hell of a racket. And then a person coming out yelling at them. I thought they were great stories. And you know, it's Bluebell Woods. And when I went to England the first time, I think I went looking for stories. You know, I talk about, I bought a moped, you know, a 49cc motor scooter when I got to England, and I rode around on it, and I went up to Yorkshire on this tiny bicycle moped. And when I went into Yorkshire, into Royston, where, you know, in Barnsley, and there was a big sign on the side of the pub that was Barnsley Bitter. And then there was signs about Leeds Football Club, and all of these things suddenly were like my father's and mother's stories jumping back at me. So that avid listening as a child, which I loved, you know, I loved all those stories. When I went for the first time as a teenager, I went looking for them, and I found them, you know, they were there. Just like I went to Bluebell Woods, I went and watched Leeds football. All that stuff, you know.
And then you kept going back. So you've had a very interesting return journey, and now you're not far from where your parents grew up.
Yeah, I think, you know, I love travel. I think that's the other thing that their stories tell. Such a daring do, isn't it? To get on a ship in Glasgow and sail all the way to Australia. And I went back to England the first time by ship across the Pacific. And then I came back by ship via South Africa. And then the last time I went by ship, I went via the Mediterranean. So, you know, so I've been around the world by ship. And now I fly, of course. It's not nearly as much fun, you know, but I love travel. And, you know, to me, if I can't travel, I feel a bit ratty. And I'm sure it's that seeding of stories about other places. You know.
So much so that I understand you have not 1, not 2, but 3 homes? Not quite.
I have a little house in France. I bought a little house in France. And in fact, the book I've just finished is about why I did something so stupid. I inherited a little bit of money and I bought a cheap house in a tiny village in France. And the book in part is about all the books I read that I think led to that. Madeline, do you remember Madeline by England?
Yeah.
All the French literature I studied at university. French films I've seen and so on. I mean, why people become culturally interested in another place. And I think I can't remember who said it, there's someone like Sykes or whoever, but that we should all adopt a country when we're born, not our country. Partly as a way of getting rid of nationals further. But okay, you're born in Australia, maybe you're English parents and so on, but pick a country somewhere that you can fall in love with and culturally appropriate in some way. And I think for me that was France. I think it's for a lot of people who live in France.
I think it was for me too.
Yeah. And so I just did. And so the book is about why I would choose a tiny village in the middle of France and get a house there. But I go there every year. And yeah, I don't know.
And is that where you were going in Australia, that if you put your house in France?
Some of the time this summer. Yeah. Anyway, it's a bit embarrassing thinking about that. I feel like it's a very privileged position to be in. And again, it goes back to that thing about who can travel and who can move around countries. Having a British passport, well, it doesn't work anymore in Europe, but I have a British passport, an Australian passport. My partner's parents are, or his mother is Maltese, so I'm getting a Maltese passport, which gives me Europe again. I mean, how many people have that privilege and, you know, are struggling to get to safe places?
And I think underlying your book is about that privilege, how your parents left a very working class Yorkshire with what they thought were limited prospects for their children and came to Australia, and the incredible impact of that capacity to migrate to Australia and the opportunities then opened up for the children. And you do reflect on the book as well.
Yeah, I think most people migrate, well, either they're fleeing horror, and we see plenty of those in small boats, as, you know, or people look for something better for their children. Generationally, they want something better for their kids. I mean, most people who migrated to Australia after, particularly those after the Second World War, like my parents really were leaving, you know, either a devastated, murderous Europe behind them, or socio-economic change. They wanted something better. I mean, when my parents left, England was still, you know, obviously rationing. They had one of the worst winters, I think 47 ever. The Dales, and the snow was so deep, people moved the houses were buried, you know. And so it's cold and bleak. And I think also my father and, you know, mother just wanted to try something else, and they did have relatives here. And I think that drive for people to somehow, if not make their own lives personally better, to make the lives of the children better. And every one of us kids has, you know, we've gone to university, my nieces and nephews have gone to university, we've all travelled, we're reasonably prosperous and healthy, and, you know, I think that they may not have been just as good in England had they stayed, certainly under certain periods of time, but I think, you know, that courage to make that choice is a hard one. And also what the children of migrants have in most cases is dual citizenship. And that gives them a certain freedom of movement, or did, you know, in Europe to the Brits, but you know, that's not an insignificant advantage in life, is it? Some people can never get away from it.
So I've got some more questions I really want to ask, but I'd like to just check if anybody's willing to ask Catherine something before I go on.
Yes, my question, is, why do you think it is that the story of British migration, like the one your parents did, doesn't have the same, you know, doesn't fit into the narrative of multiculturalism or the narrative of migration in Australia now?
Yeah, I think because it was seen as a British colony, and that when people came here, it wasn't particularly challenging for the Brits because they already spoke English. They were moving into a British style society, and the language was the same. I think that was the perception. I don't think it was like that at all. but I do think that was part of the equation, that they were coming here into a privileged society and place, but where everything would fit, you know, because they understood British life, British customs, and that was basically British Australia. But I think one of the things that didn't get thought about in all of that was Scottish people, Welsh people, or Irish people, all people from just various regions of Britain, would have a different experience depending on where they were from and their backgrounds. It was interesting. I worked once years ago with a filmmaker called Anna Kokonos. I don't know if people know Anna's name. She made Hit On and Revelations, and she made 2 of the programs that were on that recent TV series 10 Pound Poms. I don't know if it was on TV here, but it was, yeah. And Anna went and she was talking to me about it. I said, you won't believe this, I'm just finishing this book about my parents. And she said, you know, Greek background. And she said when she was working on the TV program, she stopped because she hadn't realised how much British people face racism. I said, did they really have much racism? My sense was my parents had experienced it like, say, you know, other people who didn't speak English, for example, when they arrived. And she said, oh, you know, all that stuff about 10 Pound Poms and Pommy Bastards and this, that, and the other. Whinging. And yeah, and camps, you know, whingers, all that stuff. She said, you know, that was nasty. That was really racist, nasty stuff, you know, and she said, it was good the program brought it out. You know, that to me is, you know, but why it hasn't come to the fore so much, I don't know, I'm not sure. I think it's good that other voices have been able to articulate their experiences. But it is, you know, it is interesting, isn't it? I think there was just a presumption that it would be okay for the British because they spoke English. Yeah, and we got that privileged assisted passage thing.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask a similar question that I can sort of growing up when I was in Belgium then, and there was the incredible, I don't call it racism, but I call it prejudice, and a lot of resentment, not from my generation, but in general, the 10 pound bombs and the whinging bombs. Why don't you go home if you don't like it? Get out. And in a book, or did your parents ever talk about that? Or do you know, have you, I think you probably just already answered that, but I'm surprised that that didn't come out in your memoir because it was very prevalent, very, very. It was the courage, it was the lonely opinion, you know, wherever you went.
It's interesting because I don't think that my parents ever said that.
Or they might have said it, but they could have been unaware of it.
No, I'm sure they're right. I don't think they were not aware of it. I think that it was interesting that the difference, and it may or may not have made a difference, I don't know, but my parents were sponsored by my aunt and uncle who lived in the same.
Oh, sorry.
No, but they didn't.
Just from my recollection, my memory of that era, and it was very, very strong. You know, it wasn't just casual comments, you know, and it had nothing to do, it didn't matter how aware, just if you were a comment. Yeah.
Well, you know, it just wasn't something they ever, in my recollection, said. My father had worked at a factory in Yennora, and he worked with a lot of people of non-English speaking background. And whenever he talked about experience of, you know, racism, he would talk about the people he worked with, and he himself was often quite threatened by this. You know, that if he felt that he couldn't understand what they were talking about and they were talking another language and stuff. So I don't know that it was ever raised. It truly wasn't. I mean, I would have talked about it in the book, believe me, if it had been. But I have no doubt other people experienced it too. The other thing was the school I went to. The majority of kids in my class were from non-English speaking backgrounds. So the English kids or the children of English parents tended to be in a minority, which is interesting. So in a class of 40 kids, I remember from my own childhood, 2 of the kids were only 2 kids were from parents born in Australia, and the rest were the children of parents born someone. So I don't know whether the experience was different. Whether they experienced it and didn't talk about it because they felt they didn't want to say it to us.
I wouldn't know that. I think that happens with memories and recollections, that you leave out certain, things are not.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it could be that they didn't particularly.
I think you're right, but I think also having grown up in a very multicultural area, where there was certainly comments about my comedy friend across the road, but there's a term that I've heard used before, which is relative racism, and in the spectrum of migration at the time, I think even though there was I think some racism against the English migrants, there were kind of higher levels of racism, but that term. And so it's a kind of relative thing, isn't it? Which is incredibly sad. But certainly in my experience with it was, and I hate the term melting pot because it implies something I don't mean it to imply. And you talk about this a bit too, Catherine, how, you know, one of our best friends was Italian. And I thought she was fantastic because her parents ran a local shop, and after school, she had to work in the shop, and I got to go with her, and I thought it was the best experience in the whole world working in this shop with lollies and stuff.
Yeah.
She absolutely hated it. And the girl up the road was from Lithuania, and across the road there were the Bino-Russians, and down the thing and the Italians. And so it was such a mixed community. And the thing that stunned me as I came into adulthood was to realise that some people did not grow up in a street like mine, Elwood Street, no matter Wall Street, like Catherine's, where every second house someone was a migrant. That people grew up in communities where the only migrants they ever saw was the Chinese shop, which was trying very desperately to provide Chinese food.
Well, and also, my parents mixed with English people, and we went to a Scottish Presbyterian church, and their friendship networks were all largely from the north of England. So whenever we went anywhere, we were surrounded by people who were English, whereas their children, like me and my sisters, all our friends were sort of more multicultural backgrounds. So it's just interesting, isn't it? How, I have no doubt that people experience this, believe me, but they probably did, but I don't remember it ever being a kind of source of conversation, or it was popularised or joked about, whatever, when we were growing up. I just think that maybe that's also was what contributed to that sort of blanket of Yorkshireness, a defence mechanism against that.
Gwen?
Wanted to pick up, you gave the example of being overdressed to go to the beach in Harrison, Australia. So, in the 1950s, post-war migration, after they finished with the displaced persons and started bringing the southern Italians and Greeks, and often the man came first, followed by the wife and children, as you watch it down the back. That first generation got stuck in their time and brought their daughters up under the morality that they knew from their own country. So that when they would go back to Italy or Greece in the 70s or 80s, they would be shocked to discover that girls wore miniskirts or went out by themselves, or there was drugs and so on. And had really readjusted thinking, and they'd almost, you talk about this blanket of Yorkshireness, well, of course, they preferred that their daughters married other Italians or other Greeks or even relatives or whatever, not to the point of the range. Did you have a similar clash of morality, I guess, or did your parents see that didn't see Australians as a threat to their daughters' morals?
We're all pretty uptight, well-behaved kids, I have to say, in the sense that they didn't have to, I don't think they would be worried about us in that regard. I think my father got a bit threatened when we were in our teens and he was nervous, but we went to some fellowship, church fellowship on a Friday night, which was, supposedly very well-behaved. We would kiss in the garden or whatever, but those sorts of things. I don't think that they had that sort of rigidity around that, and we were all fairly independent, and we all moved away from home very young, and got flats away, you know, so I think that was interesting. But when we were saying that, though, I remember, for people who remember the stage show Wogs Out of Work, remember that I talked about it a bit in the book. One of the defining moments for me and friends when I went to see that show, as a British background person, all that wonderful joking, and it is that joke with the edge that you're talking about, where people have experienced sort of alienation or mockery or whatever, and that's the way they draw on their experiences with Greeks and so on, to growing up and wanting to be skips, you know, they wanted to be like Aussies. And there's this amazing thing in it, I don't think you remember, where Nick Giannopoulos and another guy are dressed as Greek women working in a fruit shop factory, and they're passing an orange back and forth in silence. And then at one point, one of them says to the other, after this is about 5 minutes, and he says, "You Greek, you Greek." And every Greek person in the audience, and that was largely Greek open, went bonkers. They stamped and cheered and yelled. It was like in that moment they recognised that they were in a conversation with been had. And I thought that was really interesting, just the way people locate their own memory in the sorts of stuff, you know, you're talking about, that frozen moment where parents don't let kids do things. I just quickly want to run back. One of the best books, and one I draw on a lot in this, so there are two academics, Australians, living in England, I think both in England or one, at Manchester University. They wrote a book called 10 Pound Poems, Australia's Forgotten Migrants. And they capture through oral histories the experiences of all 10 pound poems that people prepared to participate in this study. And some of the points that were made were this thing about how people might be that it was uncouth, or Australia's well pleasant and so on. And that's a really, really good source of the way people, you know, grew up here.
I'd like to just go to a topic that Catherine and I were chatting about a little while ago, and given that we're the writers here, and that's getting published. And Catherine has been published by the big publishing houses and a variety of publishers. So did you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, I think that point made earlier about being creative, about who you go to, is really important. My first book was published by HarperCollins, you know, and then I've been published by Picador and, you know, big ones, and you get nice advance and so on. And then I went to University of Western Australia Press, where Cherry and White was running that, and there were a lot of really interesting books. She would take on books that bigger ones wouldn't take. You know, I had so many people say I wrote crime fiction, and then I started writing more literary, what I thought was more literary fiction. And then, of course, you know, your publisher doesn't want that. They want you to stay with what they see you as doing. And I've never been a writer who writes, you know, a particular way for the publisher. Maybe I should, but I don't. So, you know, I write crime fiction. I did a doctoral thesis on crime, and that got picked up as an academic book. And then I got, you know, it all published to Grover Tulay and so on. But when I wrote The Poet Who Forgot, nobody wanted that, and then Terry Ann took it. And then she published them in the next 2 or 3 books, and so on. So, you know, it was almost like going from the big ones to the smaller presses or the more literary presses and so on. And when I, with Slipstream, my agent sent it to a number of people, and Geordie Williamson at, I think it's Picador, it's still Picador, and he really loved it. And he said, "Oh, this is great. It reminds me so much of my own experiences, or my parents' experience. His grandparents, I think, were Scottish. And so he read it and thought, this is exactly like a lot of people's experiences." He said all this in the letter to the agent. But he put it up, was behind the marketing, didn't like it. And this is the big problem you're going to get with a lot of publishing houses. that you may get an editor who reads it and loves it, but the marketing people will stomp on it because it's not going to sell a lot of copies, or they think it won't have a wider appeal. So you have to be prepared for that, and then I think, you know, you have to decide where you want to go with it. And with Valley Press, there's a small press in Yorkshire, and I thought, well, the Yorkshire press should be interested in this. And a friend of mine had published with them and recommended, and that's who I went to, and they said, sure. The big disadvantage is you know, here anywhere, when you publish a book in England, it's great. You know, Valley have got this book into a whole range of countries. It's in Europe and all the rest. They can get easily, they can distribute into those places. When I came here, I got kind of booked up to do talks at Maritime Museum and festivals and stuff. Nobody could get the book. And so the publisher in England said, Ingram is the company that print them, they will distribute them, but Ingram don't do books where you return the book. Most publishers and bookshops at the moment want the book to be able to be returned if it doesn't sell. So that's one of the disadvantages of publishing in Europe with Britain and then coming to Australia, if there isn't in Australia an Australian distributor that does do a return. So when someone buys it, and it's not cheap either, because the exchange rate, it's quite an expensive book by Australian standards. So that's something to think about with small presses. But my gut feeling is always, you know, where your book, if your book isn't going to get picked up by someone you want to pick it up, who can you publish with, and can you do a hybrid or a you know, online or whatever? Just think about it. And we were saying yesterday, people rave about Virginia Woolf and Hogarth Press. Virginia Woolf would never have been published if you hadn't published those books herself. You know, Hogarth was set up to ensure that the Bloomsbury, the Wolves and various others were getting creative, really interesting work out to the world. So I think it's a positive note to finish on. Stay with your book and get it out there, but don't be frightened to think about what your options are as widely as possible. As I said earlier, your friends recommend places, talk to them as well.
So Catherine does have some copies of the book here if you want to buy them. And I'd like to get you all to join with me. Thank you, Catherine, very much for that.